Well,
a few minutes
Phil,
early. I don't know
Right,
about
start
this
recording.
meeting, so
So you're going to miss the
Yes.
sexuality part then.
probably. Yeah.
All right, I'll just cut to the chase.
Love this song.
Egalitarianism yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Should I go ahead? All right, let's go ahead. So I first developed this in 2019 and updated it. It's the first part of it is based on a nice summary that the writer Gary Wills, who some of you might know better from his Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Lincoln at Gettysburg, but he was also a classics professor, studied for the Catholic priesthood, and has written a lot about religion and culture in the U.S. and the Gospels and Paul. And then the chapter he didn't have in his book was about, that should have had, was about Paul and sexuality. So I've developed that from a couple of different sources. So let's start off with some basics about Paul. So Paul is the earliest writer in the New Testament. Maybe some writings as early as the late 40s and maybe some as late as around 60. And the only author that we know is truly the author of at least 7 of the letters that are attributed to Paul. We'll talk a little bit about what letters scholars agree are Paul and what are from the Pauline community, and some that are obviously much later. He writes before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, before the first Jewish revolt, and that's huge. Christians really need to understand this, because you really can't understand the rhetoric of the post-temple destruction in the New Testament if you don't understand how impactful the destruction of the temple was and the divisiveness that created between, it's anachronistic to say this, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, but let's apply that term retroactively. Paul didn't write everything attributed to him, as I said, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Paul saw men and women as equals, and I think I'll make that point today. And Paul lived and died as a Jew. And I've got a whole series on that I've done before, I may do that again. But just to quickly summarize that, I wrestled with, how does Paul keep his energy around God's bringing the kingdom to fruition in my lifetime for 30 plus years, or around 30 years. And I think it's because he expected, he saw Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits of the general resurrection, the resurrection of all people, which as a Pharisee, Jews, those Pharisaic Jews believe. And as the Old Testament prophets indicate, one of the signs of the coming kingdom is when the nations, the Gentiles, the Goyim in Hebrew, turn to the God of Israel. And so he was seeing that happen in his own ministry. And I think probably thought this was miraculous and a sign of the end times, and his energy around seeing that come to fruition is what fueled him, kept him going for even 30 years. Other people might say, geez, 30 years and it hasn't come yet. Maybe it's not coming. But he had plans, beyond Rome. He had plans to get to Spain. Paul's authentic writings make his encounter and his account of the risen Christ as the only first-hand account we have in the New Testament. And he was not anti-Jewish. There's a lot that we lose, especially in the book of Romans, the way the chapters and verses are written, and we lose the elements of dialectic and some other Greco-Roman debate tools, and we misread it. There's a whole presentation on that we should do too. So I'm just going to go through the Pauline writings because it becomes relevant when we talk about interpolations and imposters, I guess. So the real Paul, in what scholars think the chronological order would be the first letter to the Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon or Philemon, however you want to pronounce that, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And interestingly, 1 Corinthians in the text refers to Paul talks about my previous letter to you. So there's a 0 Corinthians that we don't have. It's not extant. And 2 Corinthians is fairly obviously a couple of different letters that are kind of pushed together. So, and one of the authors I'm reading right now suggests that chapters 10 through 13 probably were written before chapters 1 through 9. But anyway, that's getting into the weeds. And then Romans, the last consensus authentic writing of Paul. And when I say writing, understand Paul dictated, and scribes wrote this down. And there's all, I think, let's see, is it in Philippians, where at the end of the letter, Paul actually does write some stuff and points out, I'm writing this, look how big my handwriting is. Because, you know, he probably wasn't. And being a scribe, I mean, we think of it now as, you know, this is someone that was educated and very likely a slave. Scribes are very likely slaves. And you weren't working at a table like the medieval portraits show you. You were hunched over on papyrus with poor tools, and your hands were cramping up. And it was not an exalted position at all. Okay, so written by followers of Paul and carrying forward some Pauline ideas, Colossians, Ephesians. One clumsy rewrite is 2 Thessalonians, which draws largely from, word for word, from 1 Thessalonians and kind of put back together. And then things that are not from Paul's position and can be demonstrated to include ideas in church hierarchy that developed much after Paul's time would be Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timeline-wise, I don't agree with everything on this timeline, but it's pretty close, I think. So maybe in somewhere between 6 and maybe 4 Common Era, Jesus is born. We do know Herod the Great died then, so Jesus crucified somewhere in 30 to 33 Common Era. And scholars think that Paul's vision experience of the risen Jesus was maybe 3 years after that. And then somewhere around 50, Paul's first letter, and maybe later at the end of that decade, the last letter, the letter to the Romans. And then popular tradition has Paul and Peter both killed in Rome. There's a late 1st century letter called First Clement by Clement of Alexandria that states that Paul did get to the ends of the world, and that would have been Spain from the viewpoint of the Mediterranean world. I like to hope that maybe that really happened, but we don't have any evidence. It'd be great if some papyrus showed up somewhere that had some indication that might have happened, but we don't know. So, okay, so with that background, let's talk about Paul and women. Let's talk about Junia first, who is referred to in end of Romans. She's identified as an apostle, and then later church fathers even devoted a liturgy to her. And she was represented a very common male, female, evangelical team that were probably active in the 1st century. And remember, well, let me maybe point out, the community in Rome was not founded by Paul. It was there prior to Paul, probably Jewish Gentile community, and the Jews were actually banished from Rome briefly by, I'm going to get the emperor wrong, was it Nero, Bill, that sent the Jews out of Rome, and then they were allowed back in after Nero died?
I don't know. He was the first persecution.
But the Jewish Christian Messianic community was the Jewish community. Part of that was sent out of Rome and then later returned, and this led to a conflict right between the two. David, did you get?
Yeah, it's important to note that in those days, Nero and anyone else it would have been impossible for them to distinguish between a Christian and a Jew. They were all Jews. And Nero kicked the Jews out and blamed the fires in Rome on the Jews was,
Yeah,
was of
yeah.
course not
Yeah,
good.
the controversy that,
Yeah.
that he cited was some character named Christus, which is a mispronunciation of Christos, the anointed one. So they were at some argument on Christus, and that's it. You Jews have to leave. So Junia and Andronicus were exiled from that community, and we learn at the end of Romans go back there. By about the end of the 9th century, a woman apostle was unthinkable. And so she was simply erased from history. And she was erased by changing her feminine name Junia to Junius, which ironically is a masculine name that shows up nowhere else in antiquity. Interesting point, in first century, 49% of the female names were Salome or Mary. So there weren't a lot of variation in names apparently. So here's how the different translations treat this female name Junia. The English Standard Version gives a footnote that it might have been Junius. The New American Bible says Junius or Junia, which is feminine. It's Junia here in the New American Bible, and footnoted that it's a woman's name. One ancient Greek manuscript and a number of ancient versions read the name Julia. Most editors have interpreted it as a man's name, Junius. Most of those editors were probably men carrying on the tradition, maybe known to them or not known to them, that this was really added much later. In the Living Bible, it's just simply Junius, female name. I'm sorry, male name. King James Version's got Junia, Junius in the Revised Standard Version, but don't worry, we fixed that later in Junia, although they keep the footnote of Junius. But it's clearly a later imposition of an unacceptable role for a woman to have played, when clearly it's spelled out there in the manuscripts, and consistent with, we'll see in just a minute here, Paul's interaction with all kinds of male-female teams that got the name apostles, which simply means emissaries. Okay, another one is Prisca, part of a husband and wife team. Oh, I'm sorry, I conflated these two. Prisca and I think it's Andronicus, Aquila, sorry. They were the husband-wife team that were expelled from Rome, and they're the ones that are going back to Rome. And they're included in his list of people to be addressed. And there was a convention that the more important name went first, and so Prisca being listed first indicates that she probably had a higher status than her husband. We're to assume she's the husband-wife team. And perhaps due to wealth that she had. There's a tradition that thinks maybe Prisca had a hand in composing the letter to the Hebrews. I don't know how well supported that is, but part of the reason we have the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament is there was an early understanding that it could be attributed to Paul as well, but no scholars believe that anymore. Okay, Phoebe's my favorite. She's entrusted with delivering the letter to the Roman community, and she is associated with Paul's plans for mission beyond Rome into the western part of the Mediterranean basin and eventually Spain. She's identified as a prophet, and these aren't people that predict the future, but rather those that correct or reform or purify actions that are going on within a community, like the Hebrew prophets, right? And they're explaining why have things gone awry for people of Israel. Well, you didn't take care of the widow and the orphan. You didn't treat the foreigner like a member of the community. The other community members that Paul identifies, Chloe and Lydia. So you can see and we haven't even gotten to the long list, but there's a lot of women that are very active and named. If you get your name in the scripture, that's significant. There's a lot of unnamed characters in the New Testament. So to be named and to be a woman and to be in Paul's orbit is significant. So where does Paul get the misogynist reputation? Where does that come from? Two things. Interpolations that are later additions into what Paul wrote, and then impersonators, people that are writing under the umbrella of Paul or attributing their writing to Paul. So let's start off with an example of an interpolation. So in 1 Corinthians 11, we're going to go through the actual text here, but there's text in there that clearly conflicts with what Paul talks about in Galatians, and even earlier in the same letter to the Corinthians. There's language you find in that, what I'll call an interpolated text, that uses practices and all the traditions, which is language we see in what's called the pastoral epistles, Titus, Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, that is nowhere in the authentic Pauline writings. So it's phraseology that just isn't used. That isn't to say, well, maybe he started using that later. Well, maybe, but it's pretty unlikely.
So then an interpolation would be something inserted into an authentic.
Yeah, we'll see that in the next page here. In the example that I'm going to go, which is the 1 Corinthians 11 text, you can see how this interpolation disrupts the more natural reading and flow of the text with the introduction of really a completely different topic. And then I'll make one more point after we see that. So here's the interpolation. So I'll read this because it's important to get the flow. All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage with that of the other. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it out of consideration for the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I mean the other's conscience, not your own. For why should my liberty be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of the many, so that they may all be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So what's he talking about here? He's talking about food sacrificed to idols, eating in a communal setting where you may be with Gentiles that are accustomed to eating food. And if you went to the meat market, oftentimes, your only choice of meat might have been meat that was sacrificed to the local god. Interestingly, one of the Roman allowances for Jews was that they could have their own meat markets. They accommodated, out of respect for the history of Judaism, the Jewish practice of having their own meat prepared, in following essentially a kosher manner. So the text, I think, naturally continues on. Now, in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For, to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear among you you are genuine. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper, for when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry, and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in, or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. So he's still talking about the community coming together around a meal. So it seems like natural, talking about how to deal with food that was potentially sacrificed to idols, and now about how to not turn this into a drunken feast. So the suggested interpolation is this text in red that again has the traditions language and interrupts the flow. It's not about food at all. I commend you because you remember me and everything and maintain the traditions just as I hand them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or be shaved. She should wear a veil, for a man ought not to have his head veiled, since this is the image and reflection of God. But woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man is not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman. But all things come from God. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Does this nature itself teach you? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Okay, what the heck? It really interrupts the flow of things, right? I mean, and it's got the different language. It's really quite different, and I think even in Greek it appears more jarring. The other thing is that what the text in red in different manuscripts shows up in different places. So it's a little bit more evidence that, yeah, this was inserted, and it wasn't even consistently inserted into the same place. So that's what scholars think is an interpolation and not in keeping with Paul's original flow of that particular part of the text. I'll just stop and ask if there are any questions. There's a few other examples of interpolations. Yeah?
So assuming that, granted that is an interpolation, you just pointed out how clumsy it is. Is there any feeling among scholars for why they did their job?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part of that.
Is there any feeling among scholars for why the interpolator didn't do a better job?
Probably didn't feel like they had to. Maybe simply sticking it in and the whole body of the letter carrying, its importance was enough. Yeah.
Kind of like ChatGPT.
Pardon?
Kind of like ChatGPT.
Yeah. If you stuck a paragraph of ChatGPT into a letter you wrote, actually I can't remember who was telling me this, that somebody used ChatGPT to write a letter to their dying father, and it was read to the father, and the father said, that person didn't write that, recognized it. So, okay, so let's talk about impersonators. So the church of the late 1st century, following the temple destruction, was seeking to really accommodate this typical position of women within the Greco-Roman world. And part of this is related to divisions that are now beginning to grow between what would have been the Jewish Christian communities, and again, that's anachronistic to say. Not sure what the right term would be, but the term Christian really didn't even begin to be applied until early in the 2nd century. But there were two distinct groups. There were Jews who saw Jesus as the Messiah, and the fulfillment of the promise to the Jews was the turning of the Gentiles to the Jewish God, and this would bring around the kingdom of God. And then there were Gentiles who were very attracted, and especially with the missionary work of Paul, creating a pathway for Gentiles to become parts of the community and follow not all of the rules. They didn't have to convert to Judaism, which for men was good news, because circumcision was a part of the mark of being Jewish. You did have to turn away from idols and other gods. You did have to reform your sexual behavior and some other behaviors that were offensive to Judaism. But the destruction of the temple, the revolt of the Jews, created a lot of discomfort within these two different communities. And how do you, and we see it, in fact, Bill's presentation using John Dominic Crossan's parables books really showed how, I think it was especially in the Gospel of Luke, Luke becomes much more accommodating of the innocence of the Romans in the death of Jesus, and that's probably an accommodation of, hey, this community wants to continue to be a community within the Roman Empire. We need to somehow disassociate ourselves from the Jews that revolted against the Roman Empire, and yet we still are a part of this Jewish tradition that's, we think is the fulfillment of Judaism and the Messiah. So part of the way to do that was to become more accommodating of more Greco-Roman practices, which would have subjugated women's roles. So the pastoral epistles are where we start to see that becoming more dominant in the church. So this is another interpolation, and you'll see that it really echoes the later impostor, if you will. So I'll read this. What should be done then, my friends? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only two or more, or at most three, and each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to someone else sitting nearby, let the first person be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is a God not of disorder, but of peace. Anyone who claims to be a prophet or has spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I am writing to you is a command of the Lord. Anyone who does not recognize this is not to be recognized. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. So the suggested interpolation is, as in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? We go to Timothy, which is probably written 50 to 60 years later. Let a woman learn in silence and with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. A lot of parallels there that just, one, interrupt the flow. And again, this is another interpolation that in different manuscripts shows up in different places. So someone, I think later, probably felt like, well, we got to show them that we know how to keep women in their place, and we're going to put that on the lips of Paul. And even as we make the whole letter to Timothy, we're going to attribute that to Paul. Paul did have some thoughts about marriage. Was he married? We don't know. Most men of his age would have been married at the time, most Jewish men. He may have had a wife, she may have died. Maybe she was a non-believer and they were separated, or maybe he was just never married. Paul is silent on that. The Acts of the Apostles doesn't give us any insight to that. Most of the emissaries, the apostles, and other communities later were married, and they traveled with their wives, as Paul identifies when he's talking about his traveling companions. And in later writings, in the later tradition of the church, it was expected that, it was expected of the office of bishop that you would be once married. That was normal. Paul goes out of his way to emphasize that his teachings on marriage are his and not the Lord's, because he's going to contradict what Jesus says about marriage, or divorce specifically. And it's important to realize that Paul's opposition to marriage is eschatological. His sense is, the kingdom is coming so quickly, don't even bother, you don't need to get married. And this wasn't focused on men or women alone, but both. But if you're inflamed by passion, it's better to be married than to give in to your passions. So, his expectation that the kingdom of God was at hand and coming was really what fueled his opposition to marriage. It's like, don't bother. It's just there's not going to be time. But don't, And it's ironic if all these couples that are emissaries with him, carrying the message to the different churches throughout Asia Minor, were married. Presumably they were married prior to that, and he wasn't telling them not to remain married, but wasn't encouraging marriage of people that weren't married. Despite his own personal marriage preference, there were lots of couples that were obviously married. Prisca went to prison with him. There are 4 married couples that are named as working hard for the Lord in Romans. He has 2 others in Philippians. I love these names, Euodia and Syntyche. If we had 2 cats, I think I would have named them. It was a debate between that and Abelard and Heloise. But Phoebe, he refers to as his protectress. Another one he refers to like his mother. 10 women are identified that he wants to help take this message to Spain. And he identifies the woman he knows as both. One woman as an apostle and one woman as a deacon. And he knows of 2 women leaders in Philippi that are actually his rivals. And there were different rival Jewish Christian movements. A lot of Paul's letters are about trying to discredit his rivals. Apollos is one of them, where he's that branch of the movement was saying that no, you do have to become Jewish, fully Jewish. You have to convert. And Paul was saying no. The death and resurrection of Jesus, the faith of Jesus, is sufficient for the Gentiles. That's all they need to turn to the God of Israel. Well, plus stop worshiping idols and stop some of your strange, what Paul thought was strange sexual behavior. Like I said, most of this chapter, this presentation came from a chapter in Gary Will's book, and he has this terrific quote I just saw that put up. Later misogyny of the Christian church would never have occurred if the spirit of Paul had continued in them. There's an ancient, what's the term I'm looking for, the mosaic, right? That's depicting, pretty early in the church's history, female leaders. And of course, there's our own beloved Catherine Jefferts Shorey, whose lounge we're sitting in, her picture on the wall right over there. I think she's the first female Anglican prelate, right? Head of one of the churches in the Anglican community. Okay, so I hope that Charlotte Hedrick will be at the next one, because I want to redeem Paul for Charlotte. She's down on Paul. Okay, what about Paul? What does he have to say about? And again, this is anachronistic. Heterosexuality and homosexuality. Those are concepts that really are late 19th century, and to say that was to suggest that the first century world understood sexual orientation is anachronistic, but we're sort of stuck with those terms to describe that now. So let's unpack that a little bit. So with respect to heterosexuality, again, Paul's emphasis is, hey, this is my teaching, not the Lord's, but don't get married. Again, his opposition is the kingdom is coming. There's really no time. Both men and women this applies to, but again, if you're inflamed by passion, it's better that you be married. But he has a remarkably egalitarian suggestion for married couples in Corinthians. The wife has no right over her own body. It is the husband who has them. In the same way, the husband has no right over his body. The wife has them. Which I'd be curious to know more context for that. But it's remarkably egalitarian, isn't it? Right? And that's really the extent of it. I mean, it doesn't get much more into it. The marriage, the suggestion not to get married is again based on the eschatological expectation, but better to be married, and then I think the suggestion in a marriage relationship is egalitarian. Okay, so I'll apologize for the graphic, but it makes a point. Homosexuality in the Greco-Roman world was not uncommon. It wasn't perceived as strange or unusual. Paul's much more nuanced about this. His ban on homosexual behavior is essentially a restatement of the ban in Leviticus related to purity and worship in the temple. And it was a way that, throughout the history of the people of Israel, to differentiate themselves from most of their neighbors, and certainly during the Greco-Roman world. And again, almost what we now call homosexuality was very common in the Roman Empire. This new book I just got a couple weeks ago about Paul by a scholar named E.P. Sanders had a whole appendix on homosexuality in the Greco-Roman world, and it was very common. No one really thought it unusual that a man might be attracted to a man or a woman. Now there were certainly abuses of that. I think that's where Paul really heads with his opposition to it. But there's only 2 references in Paul's authentic letters to that behavior. One's in Romans and one's in Corinthians. And in Romans, I'm not going to read the whole thing. The verse, starting at verse 24, well, no, let's read the whole thing. I think the context is important. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. And the they that is being referred to here is Gentiles, who, by observing nature can see God's work at hand. For they knew God. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. What are we talking about here? Idolatry, right? Making an idol of your God. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, they were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice. full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, if they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. So, a couple things. Those attributes are derived from idolatry. Paul's saying these are the things that will overtake you because you exchange the truth about God for a lie, and you are serving the creature rather than the Creator. And in the list of really bad things, what's not included in there?
Homosexual.
Any kind of sexual behavior, period, right? I mean, these are all the list of bad things. So, what's going on here? This is from the beginning of the letter to the Romans. He's addressing both Jewish and Gentile community in Rome, and he's using, this is a part of a much bigger debate, dialectic technique. He's addressing the Gentile brothers first, saying, you should have known better. It's obvious God's handiwork is all around us, and yet you ignored and you made idols, and then because of that, all these awful things, you were covetous and you were gossips, right? So that was a result of giving up the worship of God. But in the following chapter, which I didn't read, he turns around and berates the Jews for not keeping the Jewish law as well. So it's a bit of a smackdown. He's playing to the Jewish audience who's going, yeah, you nailed those Gentiles. That's exactly how they are. And then Paul turns and says, Jewish brothers, you're no better because you don't fall. And so his point here is that all have fallen short and need the Messiah. So what do we do about the text? He calls the actions impure, degrading, unnatural, which are all similar to the language in Leviticus. It's about purity. And when he says they're unnatural, really that means that something natural would be something that was ordinary or conventional or what would be expected. And that's the same word that he uses, the same Greek word he uses later to describe natural Jews that are Jews by birth, and natural Gentiles. So unnatural is simply the unexpected, the unconventional, or out of the ordinary. And again, that really long list of bad things doesn't include any kind of sexual behavior, natural or otherwise, from there. So again, this is a part of a much larger dialectic that Paul is using in Romans to first gain the sympathy of his Jewish brothers by playing to their biases, and then showing that they're just as guilty as the Gentiles of breaking any laws, and that it's the Messiah, the Jewish law. In the Messiah, the Jewish law is fulfilled, and the purity issues in the law don't matter. Especially makes that point around food, worship to idols. He's sensitive to some groups that might not be quite there yet, in disregarding not being offended by food that might be shared at the table and worship to idols, but generally Paul's, don't worry about that. He's trying to, incline the Jewish brothers to recognize the Gentile brothers as, equal inheritors of the promise of God, and the Jews is no better off, no less vulnerable to disobeying. And then, of course, he turns around again and kind of rebukes the Gentile brothers for maybe getting too smug about this new position that they inhabit within the promise God's promise to all nations. So, in the second text, the interpretation there really hinges on a couple of key translations, and I wish I could pronounce. Who knows how to pronounce this in Greek? Is it malakoi? I don't have Greek.
Sounds good.
Arsenokoitai. So these two words, and we're going to do a little bit of a text study here because how these words get translated is really interesting throughout time. So the King James Version, know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind. And that's that ute malakoi, ute arsenikai. They translate that as abusers of themselves with mankind. Nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, let's go to the RSV. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals. So what was previously translated, abusers of themselves with mankind, that same Greek phrase is now translated in the single word homosexual. Nor thieves, nor greedy, it's the same, just after that. Later revision of the RSV changed that homosexuals to sexual perverts, which is maybe a little bit closer to what the King James Version had. And then the NRSV in '89 changed it to male prostitutes, sodomites. And again, it's that same ute malakoi, ute arsenikotai. It's the same Greek, 4 Greek letters in that phrase that are all translated in these different ways. And it keeps on going. New American Bible, this is from the Catholic tradition. Does anybody remember, I think even some of the mainline churches, when they were getting their minds around can we ordain somebody that's homosexual? And I think a lot of them said, well, yes, as long as they're not a practicing homosexual. So look what we got here, introduced into the Catholic English Bible is nor boy prostitutes nor practicing homosexuals. Okay, that's for that's how that's translating those same 4 Greek words. And then the New American Bible Revised Standard Versions, boy prostitutes nor sodomites, but they did have a note, and this is worth reading. The Greek word translated as boy prostitutes may refer to catamites, that is, boys or young men who were kept for purposes of prostitution, a practice not uncommon in the Greco-Roman world. In Greek mythology, this was the function of Ganymede, the cupbearer of the gods, whose Latin name was catamitus, if I'm saying that right. The term translated sodomites refers to adult males who indulge in homosexual practices with such boys. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more too. Homosexual was neither a concept nor a word in antiquity, and it only emerged in the late 19th century, I think like 1860s in Germany, and then it found its way into English. And well into the 12th century, the sodomite simply meant someone from Sodom, just as I'm a Spokanite. I grew up in Spokane. So if sodomite and sodomy are referring to the sins of Sodom, which they were, from ecclesiastical Latin, and they were attributed as the reasons that God's wrath was poured out on Sodom and Gomorrah. That's not in the Hebrew Bible. There's no specific sin attributed to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah that results in their destruction. But you know, those translations that use the words homosexual and sodomites are, you know, very anachronistically applying terms that either one, homosexuals didn't even exist, or two, took a word that its meaning was defined only centuries and centuries later, right? 11 centuries later, perhaps. So I'm a fan of David Bentley Hart's New Testament translation. He's very, very interesting. He's very dedicated to following the Greek, and you need a dictionary sometimes with this guy. Or do you not know that the unjust will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be led astray, neither the whoring, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor feckless sensualists, nor men who couple with catamites, nor thieves, nor the acquisitive, nor drunkards, nor the vituperatives, nor the rapacious. I don't even know. Am I a vituperative? I have no idea. Will inherit God's kingdom. So, what have we got here? We've got biblical opposition to prostitution, right, in Leviticus and in Paul's writings. And we have the biblical opposition to the abuse of sexuality, an abusive relationship. And across the board in sexual matters, the Bible really calls for mutual respect, caring, and responsible sharing. In other words, love. Sorry, my last slide disappeared. Love. Yeah, in other words, love. Bill was telling me about a presentation that I haven't watched yet on YouTube, but what was the title of Hamer's, one of his recent presentations? Why is the Christian church so fixated on sex?
Oh, sexuality. Yeah,
Sexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, for the Jews, there was a way to differentiate themselves from their neighbors, right? And that just got carried through the tradition. And I think for Paul, it probably was the abusive relationships. But I think the tradition, we need to own that background, but move beyond that. And that's the end of my presentation. Any comments or questions?
I'll ask, who would they think put in some of the what they consider the interloper texts? Or
Oh, the interpolations?
or,
Yeah, we'll never know, right? It was, it could have been a scribe, it could have been, I don't know that we'll ever know, right? And one of the pieces of research I didn't do before today, but I want to do is, when we were talking about the creation of the Bible in English, we knew there were 5,000 manuscripts of New Testament words, and I wanted to find out how many of those 5,000 are of Paul's letters.
yeah.
Not that would have the answer, but
Well, it'd be interesting to know when those were added in terms of.
yeah. Well, I think one of the clues is the comparison of the Timothy language with that second interpolation. And I think we've got a sense that Timothy was probably late first century or maybe even early first century. So that would put it probably 50-ish years after Paul would have dictated the letters.
Like about the time of the Gospels then.
Yeah. And I think most importantly, after the destruction of the temple, when you might feel like, gee, do we want to be, how do we associate ourselves with Judaism in light of this revolt that just happened, in a lot of unrest, and another revolt that actually, you don't know what's happening, but it's going to happen in 134. I think it must have just created a lot of dis-ease within this community of Gentile and Jewish followers of the Messiah. It just had to be very, very disruptive. And we see it reflected in the later New Testament writings as the Gentile group. They can't ditch their Jewish roots, but they distance themselves, right? I mean, we go from having, Pilate's ruthless and, puts Jesus on a cross to, Pilate's washing his hands, of this whole thing. Well, probably not, but if you're trying to accommodate your movement within the Roman world post-destruction of the temple, then you can understand why that would have been a technique to differentiate. We're not like those rebellious Jews. We're different, even though we're all inheriting the promise of the Jewish God.
So if Paul stayed Jewish, did he stay practicing Jewish? Do you think?
I do, yeah. Although I think
That's an interest. I mean, part of it's kind of like my background, but I'm interested in that kind of that combination because it's so separate, culturally. here. But,
Mhm.
so it's interesting to me, the merge and the combination.
Yeah, well, and remember, he died before the destruction of the temple, so he only
Right.
would have known late Second Temple Jewish practice. I mean, animal sacrifice was a part of his religious experience, and that didn't change in his lifetime.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and for Jesus too, right? I mean, the expectation, I mean, when Jesus,
You went to
a
the.
couple times oh yeah, and in the first part of Acts, where did the apostles meet? They're all worshiping the temple and teaching in the temple. They go to Jerusalem. The movement goes from Galilee to Jerusalem in Acts.
Yeah. I mean, that's just interesting to me.
Yeah, it is, and I think really understanding how divisive the destruction of the temple and then the second revolt was, just further drove a wedge between, the two groups that comprise the earliest followers of Jesus as the Messiah.
Paul would have made a great politician for today.
Yeah, we should do a little bit of exploration. When we talk about Phoebe she's charged with taking the letter to the Romans, right, which would have been read at the community. And I'd like to think that maybe she even was one to read it, which would be remarkable because there's this kind of this debate scene, and I can picture someone that really understood that delivering that and standing here to be one character and then standing over here to physically demonstrate, okay, then here's the response to that accusation, and get back, oh, by no means. What do you mean then? And this kind of this whole back and forth that this is this dialectic, and with our Bibles written like phone books with chapters and verses in the wrong places, you lose that. You don't realize that, oh, there's a made-up character here who's asking these questions and challenging, and Paul is answering the debate question for the benefit of the audience, but we lose that.
I guess why we have so many denominations, interpretation of these scriptures,
Yeah, all those.
and which Bible is best, is the New English Bible, is the King James, I mean, what?
The Greek, maybe if we read it, but even then, it's got all these manuscripts. Which manuscript you can use?
Exactly, but, other churches lay down the law according
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
the interpretation of the
well,
Bible that they have.
sexuality is
and
a
we-
powerful force in the world, right?
Women are the ones that suffer.
Yeah. But, I mean, Bishop Shorey on the wall there, right? And I go back to Gary Wills, what if that strand had become dominant? How different would the world be today, right? If those earliest church leaders who were women, what if that continued, through the ages, right? Through the Middle Ages. I mean, what would the world be like?
Well, it's interesting that in the 12th and 13th century, Mary took on the important role that had been missing in
Yeah.
Christianity.
Yeah,
And she became the loving mother and the lover who accepted people as they were, and
yeah,
that sort of female presence of God.
yeah. I think even Carl Jung said she completes the Trinity. She's the fourth element that completes the Trinity. Well, thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. I think this is one I need to do about every 4 years. Because there's always a new group, and it's just such an important topic. But the one I really enjoyed, he's retired now, but he was a New Testament professor in Texas, Michael White. And in fact, he was one of the guys on the PBS series From Jesus to Christ, I think it was called, along with Paul Frederickson and Dominic Ross. Anyway, he gave a presentation at the Episcopal Church, and it's available, I think, on YouTube. And that's where I got
Yeah.
some of this
Thanks,
stuff,
man.
like, only really German psychology kind
My
of came up
daughter's
with this
been, my
word to
granddaughter's been to
describe
bar mitzvahs.
a same-sex
it's,
orientation, right, which just was never
It's
really
interesting
a thing. I mean, it was a thing, but it never was named or understood. And also, traced the
that, and so
application of the word
it's
sodomite to,
Yeah, and I think it turns on the
took on the meaning, and up to that point, it's
I
been,
mean, I think,
Yeah,
and that's
Yeah.
hospitable.
yeah, that was it, the charge was
well, it is
in
kind of
hospitality,
hospitality.
which was a big thing.
I've gone back and read, like, when they
ancient.
first kind of started, I went back and really did
Yeah.
most of the, messages and stuff. But it's, so she's kind of, that's a big, yeah.
Greta, or she'll answer to Gretchen too.
I will, I'm gonna use that bottle of wine for dinner.
Oh, good.
This week, and so I'll.
Do you remember which one it was? I can't remember which one
I don't know, I mean, it'll be fine. But I was gonna tell you, you've done a really good job this year, having a variety of topics.
Oh, great.
Really interesting things with adult education.
Would you be interested in helping plan stuff in the future?
Maybe, but I'm actually going to go and help with transportation for my grandson for high school next
Oh.
year.
Where?
Well, it'll either be Wisconsin or upstate New
Oh,
York.
okay, so you're gonna be away for a little while.
I'm gonna be away. I'll come back and do my doctor appointments and, stuff like that, but it's just not going well. And so, anyway, that's kind of the plan right now. I still have I'll be back. Sharon's
Okay. When you're back, it's a fun trip of planning. We have a good time planning. Maybe just to be more.
Cool.